Now that we understand the idea of data and the idea that in statistics we have variability, we need to be able to define two types of variables for our data. So just like in other math classes, variables are going to be things that change. And when we are identifying these variables in statistics, these variables are those characteristics of the individuals from the population that I am studying. So two types of variables that we want to look at. The first type of variable is qualitative or categorical. Sometimes I'll say categorical because I get a little tongue-tied. In a qualitative variables allow us to perform some sort of classification, or it allows us to put things into classifications or have some sort of attribute, like a characteristic. When I think about a qualitative or categorical variable, I want to think to myself, can I group this? Can I put it into a category? An example of a qualitative variable might be color of our hair, the natural color of our hair. Marital status. So when I think about marital status could be single, married, divorced, widowed. All of those are categories that I could that have some sort of attribute or characteristic. The second type of variable is a quantitative variable. When I think about a quantitative variable, I want to think about something, can I count it? Can I measure it? Those are the two ways that I want to consider quantitative variables. Counting it, measuring it, something like that. We also want to make sure that we understand in a quantitative variable, we're going to get a number, obviously because we're counting or measuring it, and therefore that number has to have some sort of meaningful value. Okay, and we'll see what I mean by that in just a minute. For these or a couple examples, we want to determine whether or not the variable would be considered a qualitative, so a category, or quantitative, like a measurement. Let's first start with education level. Well, if I think of education level, I might think of high school graduate, post-secondary, graduate school, something like that. So because of that, I could put this into a category, and therefore it would be considered qualitative. How about temperature? When I think about the temperature, I can measure the temperature outside, or I can measure the temperature in water, something like that. So that would be considered quantitative. Number of days during the past week that a college student studied. I can count up the number of days that someone studies, so I would consider that quantitative. And finally, zip code. Zip code is a numerical value, but remember, your zip code has no numerical meaning. In other words, it's not like I'm counting all the way up to my zip code's value. Instead, your zip code is simply a location in the county or the city that you live in. So we would say zip code would be considered qualitative. Now, to summarize this, remember, a quantitative variable are going to be those that are numeric in value, and that their value has also got some sort of meaningful arithmetic operation. In other words, I could add them together, I could divide them, something like that. Whereas a qualitative variable is really just the attribute or characteristic of that individual or that data that I want to look at. Now, speaking of just quantitative variables, so we're going to focus on only quantitative variables for just a moment. We can then subdivide quantitative variables into both discrete and continuous variables. A discrete variable is something that has fixed values. Generally, I think of them as if you can count it to get the data, then that's going to be discrete. I like to think of this as some sort of integer value, or maybe I can count it on my fingers. That would be discrete. Shoe sizes are examples of discrete variables. is an example of a discrete variable. Think about your shoe size or shoe sizes in general for just a moment. We have shoe sizes that come in whole numbers like 6, 7, 8, 9, or we have whole and half numbers, so 6, 6.5, 7, 7.5. Those are fixed values, and in between each of those values is a fixed set. So I'm only going to go from a 6 to a 6.5, or I go from a 10 to a 10.5, or maybe a 10 to 11. Either way, those are fixed values. We might consider the number of patients on a hospital floor. That's also considered a discrete variable. I can count the number of patients on a hospital floor. Continuous variables are those that are going to be continuous in their scale. So generally, if I can measure it, I would consider that a continuous variable. So things like weight, blood pressure, temperature, all of those things would be considered continuous variables. Now let's take a moment and see if we can not only determine whether or not a variable is qualitative or quantitative, but if it's quantitative, let's see if we can break it down further and identify discrete versus continuous. So the first example we have here would be gender. Well, gender is not really a measurement. That is some sort of attribute. That means that it would be qualitative in nature. How about income status? Income status, in other words, if you had to choose whether you were middle income, low income, high income, all of those again are attributes or characteristics, and therefore again would be qualitative. Now let's look at income. Income would be, let's say, a measurement that I could have. So we could say income is going to be quantitative. Depending on how we identify the income, we could talk about salary as being discrete. So let's say that we want to talk about salaries for teachers. Okay, so my income amount is going to only increase or decrease or be separate from another person by, let's say, whole dollar amounts. So that would be the discrete portion of this variable. That's how if I described income in that way. If, however, I wanted to talk about the average salary, let's say, for teachers in Texas, well, average salary is going to end up being a continuous variable, because when I take the average of something, then I could get all sorts of decimal values that would be falling into that. So you can see that depending on the question that I'm asking, I could maybe come up with either discrete or continuous for this term of income. How about grade earned in an algebra class? Well, once again, if I'm only looking at this phrase, it makes it a little difficult. Sometimes if we're cherry picking a variable, it's a little hard to identify whether we're talking discrete or continuous, whether we're talking qualitative, quantitative, if we're only looking at a phrase. This is where context clues might give us more information. But let's just look on the face of this as a grade earned in algebra. If I wanted to talk about my letter grade in algebra, we would consider that a qualitative, a categorical variable, right? If I have a letter grade in my class, like A, B, C, D, F, those are categories for my grade. If, however, I wanted to talk about a numerical value for my algebra grade, so let's say I made a 95 or a 96 in my algebra course, then it would be considered a discrete, a quantitative, and a discrete variable. So again, depending on how I am defining the word grade, if I want to talk about it as a letter grade, it becomes categorical or qualitative. If I want to talk about it as some sort of numerical grade, we're looking at a quantitative variable because we're measuring it, and it's discrete because we are going from, say, 95 to 96 to 97. And then finally, how about the number of children in a classroom? Well, I'm going to count up how many children would be in a classroom, so that makes it quantitative. It's not a category. And because I am actually counting it, I'm looking at some sort of discrete value. It wouldn't be continuous because we don't have partial children, right? We don't have 2.6 children in the room. We would have 2 children. So a variable is considered discrete if its value results from counting, and a variable would be considered continuous if it's a value that's measured.